Imagine waking up in a place you don't recognize, a world that mirrors reality but feels undeniably wrong. It's not the dead silence that chills you, nor the unrelenting darkness, but the sensation that you're being watched. Now, imagine that the one person who claims to save you might just be the one who keeps you trapped. This is not a story of heroes and villains. This is a story of mistakes, regret, and the tangled emotions that bind us to our fears and to each other. Elise sat perched on the edge of her couch, staring blankly at her phone. The screen glowed with unread messages, and each notification felt like a hammer on her chest. The living room was quiet, save for the tinny laughter of a sitcom she wasn't watching. Elise hated sitcoms, but tonight she was trying to hate herself a little less. For hours into her spiral, she was still clutching her hoodie, a faded emblem of a college she wasn't sure she wanted to attend anymore. Across from her, Nate sat quietly, his gaze heavy with concern. He'd been her friend, anchor, and protector for as long as she could remember. But even he couldn't fix this. The texts on her phone were all from one person, Adrian Ford, her conservation biology professor. Her mistake. 3 months ago, Elise had been drawn to Adrian's charm, his intelligence, and his ability to make her feel seen in a sea of anonymity. But the red flags had always been there, waving in plain sight. The excuses, the secrecy, the diner 2 towns over where they met in shadows. She'd ignored them all. And now, here she was. "You can't just leave it like this," Nate said, breaking the silence. "You need to stand up for yourself." Elise wanted to believe she could. But the thought of facing Adrian, of confronting the man who made her feel so small and so wanted all at once, tied her stomach in knots. Her phone dinged again. Another message. "Adrian, let's meet. Just talk. Please." By the time Elise typed her reply, her hands were trembling. "Fine. But this is goodbye." Her resolve felt paper-thin, but she clung to it like a lifeline. As the clock neared midnight, she pulled on a sweater and left her apartment. The bus ride to the diner was a blur of streetlights and self-doubt. She didn't know it yet, but this would be the last familiar moment of her life. The diner was just as she remembered it, flickering neon signs and the faint stench of cigarette smoke. But tonight, something felt off. The parking lot was empty, save for an old SUV idling in the corner. A woman stepped out, her silhouette sharp against the dim glow of the street lamp. Elise froze. The woman stormed toward her, eyes blazing with fury. "You have some nerve showing up here," she spat. It took Elise a moment to piece it together. This was Lily, Adrian's wife. The slap came before Elise could react, leaving her cheek stinging and her pride shattered. "You destroyed my family," Lily accused, her voice trembling with rage. Elise tried to explain, to say she didn't know, but the words felt hollow. She wanted to run, to disappear. But as Lily's SUV sped away, kicking gravel into the night, Elise found herself rooted to the spot. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't bother looking. Adrian's voice played in her mind, smooth and manipulative. "I need you. Only you." She turned and walked anywhere but here. The Hallmark Theater loomed in the distance, its marquee a ghostly relic of better days. Elise didn't know why she was drawn to it, but the worn metal doors felt like a refuge. She bought a ticket to whatever was playing and stepped into the dimly lit lobby. The smell of popcorn and mildew clung to the air. The place was almost empty, save for a disinterested teenager at the counter. She took a seat in the middle row of Theater 4, pulling her knees to her chest as the previews rolled. For the first time that night, she felt still. But the stillness didn't last. As the opening credits played, a strange sensation washed over her. A prickling at the back of her neck, as if unseen eyes were watching. She glanced over her shoulder. Nothing. Just the flicker of the projector and the empty rows behind her. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling. The movie was a blur. Her eyelids grew heavy, and soon, exhaustion overtook her. When she woke, the screen was dark, the theater silent. Her phone read 3:42 a.m. The last bus was long gone. As she made her way to the exit, she noticed something odd. The lobby was empty. The teenager at the counter was gone, replaced by shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. Her breath quickened. She pushed through the heavy doors, expecting the cool night air. Instead, she was met with fog, thick, suffocating fog that blurred the world around her. She wasn't outside. She was somewhere else. The Holmont Theater was no longer the rundown building she entered. It was alive with darkness, every corner pulsating with an otherworldly energy. The walls seemed to close in, the air heavy with the scent of decay. And then, she heard it. A voice, low and gravelly, calling her name. The man emerged from the shadows. His face was partially hidden, his features sharp and haunting. His name was Silas, and he was both a savior and a stranger. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice tinged with warning. Elise didn't know whether to trust him. But as the walls of the theater shifted and groaned, as unseen forces stirred in the darkness, she realized she might not have a choice. What followed was a harrowing journey through a place that defied logic. Elise and Silas navigated a labyrinth of twisted hallways and memories that weren't their own. The theater seemed to feed on their fears, conjuring visions of their past mistakes and deepest regrets. For Elise, it was Adrian's voice, smooth and mocking. For Silas, it was something far darker, a reflection of the monster he believed himself to be. As their paths intertwined, a fragile bond began to form. Silas, who had spent years trapped in this liminal space, was drawn to Elise's resilience. And Elise, despite her fear, saw glimpses of humanity in Silas's haunted eyes. But the theater was not a place for redemption. It was a place for reckoning. The fog outside the theater thickened with every passing moment, an oppressive blanket that seemed to hum with energy. Silas's steps were deliberate as he led Elise through a door she hadn't noticed before. The air grew colder, and the faint hum turned into a low, ominous vibration. "What is this place?" Elise finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Silas glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "A trap. A mirror. It's whatever it needs to be." Elise frowned. "That doesn't make any sense." "It's not supposed to." They emerged into a vast room that defied logic. The walls stretched endlessly, lined with what appeared to be doors, each one different in size, shape, and design. Some glowed faintly, while others seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. "What are these?" Elise asked, stepping closer to one of the doors. Silas's hand shot out, gripping her wrist tightly. "Don't." The warning in his voice froze her in place. "Why?" "Because behind every door is a truth you're not ready for." Elise pulled her hand free, her eyes narrowing. "You don't get to decide what I'm ready for." Silas stepped back, his jaw tightening. "Then go ahead. Open it. But don't say I didn't warn you." The challenge hung in the air between them. Elise hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle of the nearest door. Something about it called to her, a faint, familiar pull she couldn't ignore. She turned the handle. The door swung open silently, revealing a scene she hadn't expected. It was her dorm room, perfectly recreated down to the smallest detail. Her textbooks were scattered across the desk, and her favorite mug sat half full of cold coffee. But the room wasn't empty. Sitting on her bed was Adrian. He looked up as she stepped inside, his smile disarming and infuriating all at once. "Elise," he said, his tone warm and familiar. I was wondering when you'd show up. Behind her, Silas's voice was sharp. Get out of there. Elise ignored him, her focus entirely on Adrian. This isn't real, she said, more to herself than to him. Adrian stood, his movements slow and deliberate. Real or not, does it matter? I'm here. We can talk like we used to. Her chest tightened. We have nothing to talk about. He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. Don't we? You left things unfinished, Elise. You walked away without giving me a chance to explain. Explain what? Her voice cracked. That you lied? That you used me? Adrian's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked almost sincere. I never meant to hurt you. You have to believe that. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. I don't have to believe anything. Behind her, Silas's voice grew louder, more urgent. Elise, you need to leave. Now. But she couldn't move. The room seemed to close in around her, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Adrian's presence was intoxicating, and she hated herself for it. You don't belong here, Adrian said, his voice low. Stay with me. We can figure this out together. Something in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't warmth or sincerity, it was possession. She took a step back, her resolve hardening. You don't get to keep me here. Adrian's smile faded, replaced by something darker. I'm not the one keeping you here. The door slammed shut behind her, and the room dissolved into shadows. Elise stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Silas was there, his hands steadying her. I told you not to open it, he said, his voice tight with frustration. What was that? She whispered. Your past, Silas replied. This place feeds on it, and if you're not careful, it will consume you. The tension between them was intense as they moved through the labyrinth. The doors seemed to multiply, each one pulsing with its sinister energy. Elise's mind raced with questions, but she couldn't bring herself to ask them. Silas finally broke the silence. If we're going to survive this, you need to trust me. Elise shot him a skeptical look. Trust you? I don't even know you. He stopped, turning to face her. You know enough. And right now, I'm all you've got. She hated that he was right. But as the walls around them groaned and shifted, she realized she didn't have a choice. For now, trust would have to be enough. As they ventured deeper into the labyrinth, Elise's steps grew heavier with exhaustion. Every corridor looked the same, lined with doors that pulsed faintly like veins under the skin. The air was stifling, and an oppressive silence enveloped them, broken only by the occasional groan of the walls. Silas suddenly stopped, his body tense. We're not alone. Elise's heart skipped. What do you mean? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Silas's gaze darted around the corridor, his jaw clenched. It's found us. What has? Elise demanded, panic bubbling to the surface. Before he could answer, a low growl reverberated through the hall. The sound was guttural, unnatural, like a beast dragging itself from the depths of some unspeakable nightmare. Elise turned instinctively, but the fog seemed to twist and curl, obscuring her vision. Run, Silas hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something wet and heavy slapping against the floor. Elise didn't need to see it to know it was gaining on them. Her lungs burned as they ran, the corridors shifting and changing around them. Doors appeared and vanished, the walls pulsing with an almost sentient malice. Elise stumbled, her legs threatening to give out, but Silas's grip on her arm was firm, unrelenting. This way, he shouted, yanking her through a narrow passage that hadn't been there moments before. The growling faded slightly, but Elise could still hear the creature's pursuit, its heavy, uneven breaths echoing in the distance. They burst into a small chamber, the walls covered in strange, glowing symbols that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her racing heart. Silas released her arm and turned, his body tense, his eyes scanning the doorway. It won't follow us in here. Not yet. Elise collapsed against the wall, struggling to catch her breath. What the hell was that? She gasped. Silas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched, running his fingers along the glowing symbols on the wall. A warden, he said finally. This place's way of keeping order. That thing is supposed to be order? Elisa's voice was sharp, disbelief laced with fear. It's not meant to be understood, Silas replied, his tone flat. It's meant to keep us in line. Elise pressed her hands to her temples, trying to steady her spiraling thoughts. Why is it after us? Silas stood, his expression unreadable. Because we're trying to leave. The chamber fell into a tense silence, broken only by Elisa's ragged breathing. She looked up at Silas, her eyes searching his face for answers. Have you ever seen anyone escape? He hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. No, her stomach sank. Then why are you helping me? Silas's gaze softened, a flicker of something almost human crossing his face. Because you don't belong here. Elise didn't know whether to feel comforted or terrified by his words. Before she could respond, the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, their rhythm quickening. Silas's head snapped toward the doorway. It's coming. But you said, Elise started, her voice rising in panic. It's adapting, Silas interrupted, his tone grim. We need to move. Now. He reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't hesitate. Together, they plunged back into the maze, the growl of the warden echoing behind them like a promise of doom. The corridors twisted and writhed as if alive, shifting with every step they took. The oppressive fog seeped through cracks in the walls, snaking around their ankles and obscuring the path ahead. Elise's heart thundered in her chest, each beat resonating with the guttural growl that pursued them. Silas led her with unerring confidence, his grip on her hand firm and steady. He seemed to sense the labyrinth's shifts before they happened, veering left or ducking into unseen passages at the last moment. But even his quick movements couldn't outpace the warden. It was closer now, the sound of its uneven gait, wet, heavy, and relentless, filled the air. Elise dared a glance over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. The thing was a mass of writhing shadows, its form indistinct but horrifyingly wrong. Glimpses of jagged teeth and twisted limbs appeared and vanished within its amorphous body, its glowing eyes fixed solely on her. Silas, she cried, her voice breaking with terror. It's right there. Don't look at it, he snapped, yanking her around a sharp corner. It'll only feed on your fear. Feed on my fear? She repeated incredulously. I'm terrified. What am I supposed to do about that? He didn't answer, his focus entirely on the path ahead. The walls around them began to vibrate, the pulsating rhythm of the labyrinth growing louder and more erratic. Elise could feel it in her bones, a deep, thrumming resonance that threatened to unhinge her completely. The passage opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. The floor was uneven, scattered with jagged stones that glowed faintly underfoot. In the center of the room stood a massive, intricately carved door, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols as the chamber they had left behind. There, Silas shouted, pulling her toward it. If we can reach the door. A deafening roar cut him off, the sound reverberating through the chamber like a thunderclap. Elise stumbled, clutching at Silas to keep from falling. The warden was in the room now, its grotesque form filling the entrance they had just passed through. Go! Silas barked, shoving her toward the door. "I'll hold it off." "What?" "No," Elise protested, digging her heels into the ground. "You can't fight that thing." "I don't have to fight it," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "I just need to distract it long enough for you to get through the door." Elise's eyes darted between him and the door, panic rising like a tidal wave. "What happens if I go through? What happens to you?" He didn't answer, his focus on the warden as it began to advance. "Elise, go now. This is your chance." Tears stung her eyes, but she forced herself to move, her legs trembling as she sprinted toward the door. The symbols on its surface flared brighter as she approached, their light almost blinding. She placed her hands on the carvings, their warmth seeping into her skin. The door began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to push back the oppressive energy of the room. Behind her, she heard Silas shout, a guttural, primal sound that echoed with pain and defiance. She turned, just for a moment, and saw him standing his ground, a blade of shimmering light in his hand as he faced the warden. The creature lunged, its shadowy form swallowing the light around it. "Silas!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Go!" he roared, his eyes locking with hers for one fleeting moment before the warden's mass enveloped him. The light enveloped Elise, wrapping her in a warmth that contrasted starkly with the cold terror she had just escaped. She felt weightless, as though she were floating through an infinite expanse, detached from time and space. The roar of the warden and Silas's cries were replaced by an eerie stillness, punctuated only by the faint hum of the light. Gradually, the brightness dimmed, and Elise found herself standing in an open field. The sky above was a deep indigo, scattered with stars that seemed closer and brighter than she had ever seen. The grass beneath her feet was soft, almost luminous, swaying gently despite the absence of wind. She turned in a slow circle, taking in her surroundings. In the distance, a lone tree stood tall, its twisted branches reaching toward the heavens. Beyond it, faint shadows hinted at mountains, their peaks shrouded in mist. It was beautiful, yet unnervingly quiet. "Silas," she called, her voice trembling. The name echoed faintly, as though the field itself were reluctant to respond. There was no answer, no sign of him. Only the vast, surreal landscape stretched out before her. A surge of guilt and worry crashed over her. She had left him behind. The image of Silas facing the warden, his blade glowing defiantly, burned in her mind. What had become of him? Was he still alive? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, like the chime of distant bells. Elise turned toward it, her heart racing. The sound grew louder, more melodic, drawing her toward the lone tree. Each step she took felt heavier, as though the ground beneath her was resisting her movement. As she approached the tree, she noticed something peculiar. Carved into its bark were symbols, similar to the ones she had seen in the labyrinth and on the door. They pulsed faintly, their light synchronized with the chime. Elise reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the rough surface. The moment she made contact, the world shifted. The field dissolved, replaced by a dark, cavernous space. The air was thick and damp, the walls glistening as if alive. A faint glow emanated from the floor, illuminating a path that stretched into the unknown. "Welcome, Elise," a voice echoed, low and resonant. It wasn't Silas. It wasn't Adrian. It was something else entirely. Her pulse quickened. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice echoing back to her. The glow on the path ahead intensified, revealing a figure cloaked in shadows. Its form was indistinct, constantly shifting, as though it were made of smoke and light. Yet its presence was overwhelming, filling the cavern with an energy that made Elise's skin crawl. "You have come far," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the space. "But your journey is far from over." Elise clenched her fists, forcing herself to stand tall despite the fear threatening to consume her. "What do you want?" The figure didn't move, but its presence seemed to draw closer. "It is not what I want, but what you seek. The answers you crave lie ahead. But beware, Elise. Every step forward demands a piece of you." "A piece of me," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure extended a hand, and in its palm appeared a shimmering orb of light. Within it, Elise glimpsed fleeting images, her past, her fears, and something deeper, more profound. The labyrinth tests all who enter, but few emerge whole. Elise's mind raced. She thought of Silas, of his warnings and his sacrifice. Was this what he had faced? And if she pressed on, would she lose herself in the process? The path ahead glowed brighter, the symbols on the floor beckoning her forward. Elise took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I don't have a choice," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. The figure's form shimmered, its edges blurring. "No one ever does." With that, the figure vanished, leaving Elise alone once more. She turned toward the glowing path, her resolve hardening. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it for herself and Silas. And so, she stepped forward into the unknown. The glow of the path intensified with each step, almost blinding, yet compelling her to move forward. The cavern seemed endless, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. Elise's mind raced with questions. Where was she? What was she meant to find? And most importantly, was Silas truly gone? The path abruptly ended, opening into a circular chamber. The walls glistened like wet obsidian, and in the center stood a pedestal holding a crystalline orb. The orb pulsed with a rhythm that mirrored her heartbeat as if it were alive. "What is this?" Elise murmured, her voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. The orb shimmered, and images began to flicker within its depths. She saw herself as a child, laughing and carefree. The scene shifted to her teenage years, moments of triumph and heartbreak flashing like a montage. Then, darker memories emerged. Adrian's face, Lily's rage, and Silas's defiance. Each image felt like a blow, forcing her to confront the weight of her choices. "Do you understand now?" the voice from before asked, echoing through the chamber. The figure of smoke and light reappeared, its presence as overwhelming as before. "Understand what?" Elise demanded, her voice trembling. "That I've made mistakes? That I've hurt people?" The figure moved closer, its form shifting and twisting. "That every choice carries a price. The labyrinth does not punish, Elise. It reveals." "Reveals what?" She pressed, her frustration boiling over. "What am I supposed to do with all this?" The figure extended a hand toward the orb. "The answer lies within. But once you take it, there is no turning back." Elise hesitated, staring at the orb. Her reflection wavered on its surface, distorted and fragmented. She thought of Silas, of the sacrifices he had made to bring her this far. Could she honor that by turning away? "What happens if I take it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The figure did not answer. Instead, it dissolved into the air, leaving her alone with the orb and her decision. Elise's hands trembled as she reached for the crystalline surface. The moment her fingers brushed it, a surge of energy coursed through her, overwhelming and all-consuming. The chamber dissolved around her, replaced by a swirling void of light and shadow. Voices echoed in the void, Silas's, Adrian's, even her own. They spoke of choices, regrets, and the unknown paths not taken. She felt herself being pulled in every direction, her very essence unraveling. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Elise found herself back in the field beneath the indigo sky. The lone tree stood before her, its branches now glowing faintly. In her hand, she still held the orb, its light dim but steady. A figure stood in the distance, silhouetted against the stars. It was tall and familiar, though she couldn't make out the details. "Silas," she called, her voice echoing faintly. The figure didn't respond, but turned and began walking away, its movements deliberate and slow. Elise's heart ached with a mix of hope and dread. She took a step forward, then another, following the figure into the endless horizon. As she walked, questions swirled in her mind. Was it truly Silas? Was the orb a gift or a curse? And what price had she truly paid to escape the labyrinth? The answers remained elusive, shrouded in the same fog that had haunted her journey. But one thing was certain, her story was far from over. What would you have done in her place? And do we ever truly escape the labyrinths of our own making?
Thank you so much for joining me today and for taking the time to dive into this incredible story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you liked what you saw, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and any suggestions for future stories. And just a heads up, I've got a brand new thrilling story dropping tomorrow, so make sure to stay tuned. Thanks again for your support, and I'll see you in the next one.